Now, where does the law come from? Now we're going to move into the three sources of law. The first and foremost being the Constitution. So some brief Canadian history. The Constitution Act of 1867 created the basic rules for our political and legal systems. Very importantly for your knowledge in this course, it outlined the division of powers between the federal and provincial governments. All this means is that there are certain areas of law that we say that the federal government can make laws about, and there are certain areas where we say the provincial government can make laws about. And if either of those governments legislates or makes a law that is outside of that jurisdiction, then that law is what we call ultra vires, or has no force and effect because it is beyond the powers that were prescribed to that level of government. In 1960, we had the Canadian Bill of Rights, which was the first introduction to codifying human rights in Canada. While this was a really big step, it wasn't yet codified in the Constitution, which is why the Constitution Act of 1982 is so important, because that actually gave Canada the opportunity to amend its own constitution independently and codified the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which provides all Canadians with basic rights and equality under the law. If there is a conflict between federal and provincial laws, then the doctrine of federal paramountcy applies, which will give no force or effect to the portion or entirety of the provincial law that conflicts with the federal law. So why is the Constitution such a big deal? Other than all of these things that it does to set up the structure for our society and freedom and democracy, great. Why do we care about it? What's important to know for this course? And the first thing is that all other laws must comply with the Constitution. And in my view, this is why it's such a big deal. If a law is found to be not aligned with the Constitution, then that law will have no force or effect. Second, compared to other laws, the Constitution is actually really hard to change. There's this whole formula where you need the cooperation of a certain amount of provinces with a certain amount of the population in order to make things happen. And it's not important here to know the formula. What is important, obviously I don't. What is important is that you understand that compared to legislation or case law, which are our other two sources of law, it's really difficult to change the Constitution. And that's why we take our constitutional laws so seriously, because they are entrenched within our Canadian culture and rights. Third and final on the Constitution and your charter rights. It's really important for you to understand that when it comes to your charter rights, it only applies if you are complaining about the government. Having said that, the charter is subject to reasonable limits. And what that means is that if something can be justified under a free and democratic society, then there might be some exceptions to all of those freedoms that we enjoy. A really good example of that is prison. Being detained or put into jail is a violation of your Section 7 rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. However, it's something that as a society, we tend to agree is okay for our greater good and safety. There are two more sections I want to point out before moving on from the Charter and the Constitution. The first is Section 33, which has the notwithstanding clause. And so that continues on the rhetoric of the reasonable limits to the Charter. And that section essentially says that Parliament or legislation may be able to create and enforce a law even though it violates the Charter. And that's called the notwithstanding clause, but every time you hear the word notwithstanding, you can just replace it with even though. The second source of law and the most common source of law is legislation. And legislation are laws that are written down by government. You can find most of them in Alberta on the Court of King's Printer website, and I've linked here the Health Professions Act because that's my home statute. I'm in there all the time. But you can basically find an act for everything. There's one for family law, for criminal law, for tax law, you name it. Last but not least, we have the courts. also known as common law, also known as judge-made law, also known as case law, also known as precedent. Essentially, when there is a dispute that's heard by a court and a judge renders a decision on that dispute, it's usually in writing, and then that decision becomes precedent or something that is relied on for future cases with similar facts and issues. But for the purposes of the sources of law, we need to know that in addition to the Constitution and legislation, that we have cases coming out of courts that form the common law. I've linked here a link to an online journal by a former classmate of mine called Hearsay, and they do a really good job of summarizing case law in a really digestible and entertaining way. And so for all you future lawyers or lawyers that are looking for some topical updates on case law, I suggest you check that out.